Hello and welcome to the Natural Gas Emergencies presentation that we did several weeks ago. This is the online version that we're recording for home use, so people that weren't there could see what we covered and have an understanding of our procedure and metering equipment. So the objectives of this presentation will be to review the operation of the portable monitoring equipment that we have at the Wexford Volunteer Fire Company, and to introduce the SOG number SO6 that deals with responding to natural gas emergencies. So here's the motivation for this presentation. Why have a training on responding to natural gas emergencies? And what you can do is when I'm finished speaking on this slide, just click the picture and the video will play of this incident that occurred in Prince George's County, Maryland. The fire department responded to a reported natural gas leak in a vacant tenant space in a strip mall. And after 23 minutes or approximately thereabouts of operating on scene, they had an explosion occur. So and really think about this incident in that we respond to natural gas emergencies on a relatively regular basis. I think last year we responded about 21 natural gas calls. A lot of them were outside leaks, either line strikes or just odor investigations, but we did have several leaks that were inside a structure. And a lot of times it sort of becomes a routine or just kind of let your guard down type incident, but there's a very real hazard involved with these incidents as we see in this video here. And the reason kind of is the reasoning behind the SOG and the reason to do the training on this SOG. So go ahead and click the link and watch the video play. It's very short. So hopefully that was a bit of a wake-up call for the video that you just watched. The incident there, they were operating on, like I said, for about 23 minutes. And really a good thing to do is, if you remember a few weeks ago, I put out an email of the NIOSH investigation of that incident. And if you have some time, to try to find that PDF that I put out, or let me know and I can resend it to you. And go and read, even if you don't read through the full report, just the first few pages, guys, kind of gives you a good summary of what they were doing and how they were operating at that incident. And as I go through this presentation, I'll try to tie back to some things that happened at that incident that we can draw from to learn from. So the portable gas monitoring equipment that we have at the Wexford Volunteer Fire Company includes an MSA Altair 5X multi-gas detector and TIFF Instruments Incorporated TIFF 8800X combustible gas detector. So the next few slides, what we're going to do is review the operation of each piece of equipment so that you can become more familiar with it and its operation. So the MSA Altair 5X, what this is designed to do is monitor for carbon monoxide, your oxygen level, whether you're in an oxygen enriched or oxygen deficient environment, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, and what we're going to be focusing on in this presentation is the lower explosive limit or the combustible gas level. So when you turn on the meter, what it's going to do, it's going to go through a setup process. It takes about maybe a minute to 2 minutes to go through this process. So the next few slides, what we're going to do is tell you what you're going to be seeing and as it goes through this setup process. So you turn it on, that center button at the bottom of the screen, the little with the little power icon. You just press that in, hold that for a second or two, and it kicks on. And it's going to go through just like an initial, tells you what the serial number of the meter is, and then it's going to ask you for a pump test, and it's not going to let you proceed until you do this pump test. And what you have to do here is block the sampling system, and you can do that by either blocking the inlet port at the top of the meter, or if we have a sampling tube attached, and we'll talk more about the sampling tube and probe later, but when you have that attached, you want to block that pump test or do that pump test with that from the tip of the probe. And ideally, when we talk later about the probe, in a lot of the situations, we want to be using that probe, and this is where you want to do the pump test with that probe attached to make sure there's not a leak anywhere in that system. So once you block that, the meter will tell you whether or not it passed that system, and then it goes on to the next part of the process. So there you see in this next screen, it says the pump flow was blocked and the pump test passed, and it's going to continue on in its setup of the meter. The next screen you're going to see is the sensors and measurement screen. What you're seeing here is the sensors that are installed on the screen and how it measures those different items or those different products or elements. So you can see here, the top of the screen, you have combustible gas is measured by percent LEL or lower explosive limit. Oxygen is by percent volume in air of O2. And then the three on the bottom, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen cyanide are all parts per million. Okay, it also tells you the gas type at the bottom, pentane. What that's telling you is the calibration gas that's used for this meter is a pentane simulant gas. So the meter is programmed with low alarm settings. These are factory settings that come with the meter, but we can't alter these, but we've just chosen to leave them at the factory settings. So you can see for combustible gas, that top left one, COMB, we're looking at 10% LEL is the low alarm setting for the situations that we're going to be talking about here today, the combustible gas situations. And then you can just go through the rest of the sensors. O2 at 19.5%, carbon monoxide, the low alarm starts at 25 parts per million, hydrogen sulfide is 10 parts per million, hydrogen cyanide is 4.5 parts per million. Okay, the also has high alarm settings. Again, these are the factory presets. We can adjust these to within a certain range, but we left them at the factory presets. And going back again to LEL or that combustible gas setting or sensor, the high alarm, it's going to go off at 20 parts per million. And the rest, oxygen is 23, and then the 100 parts per million CO, 15 H2S, and 10 HCN. High alarm settings. The short-term alarm settings, short-term exposure limits. This is something you're going to see come up on the screen, but this is really something that is not really applicable to the fire service. This is more of industrial setting, a factory or some type of plant where they're maybe making entry into a confined space to clean a tank or something like that. They're allowed to be exposed to a short-term level of these different carbon monoxide or what have you. More of an OSHA thing, not something that we need to be concerned about. Next thing that come up, same thing, the time-weighted average alarm settings. Again, going back to OSHA, someone working over an 8-hour period, what the amount that they can be exposed to, not really applicable to what we use the meter for. The calibration cylinder values is the next screen you're going to see, and you can just see for the different sensors what that optimum level that the calibration, when it goes through calibration, the optimum level that it needs to read from that calibration cylinder. So you can see what those levels are for all the different readings. Next screen it comes up is the last calibration date, and you can see here that when this picture was taken, the last calibration was on March 16th, 2015. And if you look at the little battery icon, if you can see there to the right, there's a little check mark, and that just tells you that it was a successful calibration. Next screen you're going to see is the sensor warm up. And depending on how long it's been since the meter's been turned on, this takes anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute. If you turn the meter off, you've been running it for a while, and you turn the meter off and you turn it back on, it's something that might just take a second just to go through the sensor warm up. So that's that screen. Next screen you're going to see is a prompt screen. It's going to ask you fresh air setup, yes or no. And it's a point of caution here is if you're going to hit yes for fresh air setup is to make absolutely sure that you're in a fresh air environment. So, if you're up at the scene, you get out of the truck and you're potentially standing in a natural gas contaminated environment, you don't want to hit that fresh air setup, because basically what you're telling the meter is that this is a baseline. This is fresh air, and it's that's where it's going to start its readings from. So what you don't want to do is knock those sensors out of range by saying yes, you're in fresh air, when in fact you're not. So best thing to do here is, if you're not sure, is either to click no, or if you just don't, I think after about 20 seconds, this times out and it just moves on, not answer it at all. Okay, but just make absolutely sure that you feel that you're confident you're in a fresh air setup. So, and I will talk later about the procedures for starting this meter up. Ideally, we want to start it on the ride to the scene. And, most cases driving down the road in a cab, that's probably relatively close to being in fresh air. What we really want to worry about is not being in the contaminated environment, or an environment, maybe in a garage after the trucks have been running or something like that. Probably not a fresh air environment. The measurement mode screen, so once it's gone through that fresh air setup, you get through that screen, it goes in measurement mode, and this is the screen you'll see when you're ready to actually go and take samples of the environment that you need to go to. So this is the screen that you'll see. And just to point out on the screen, you see that it has the time on there. At the bottom, you'll see the bump and the calibration flags. Those respond to you see the down arrow and the up arrow. If you would press those arrows, that's what's going to put you into that the bump or the cal. The down arrow, you actually can scroll through other functions that will different things you can see in the meter, like you can get back to the short-term exposure limit screens, and one of the functions that you can get to is a screen that tells you what your peak readings were. So if you just keep scrolling down with that down arrow until you see the peak readings come up, that could be useful in situations where you're sampling in a house, whether it be natural gas or maybe it's a lot of times carbon monoxide. You get into situations where, well, hey, we were down in the basement and that was our highest reading, but I can't remember, was it 20 parts per million or was it 15 parts per million? This will give you a record to go back to see what your peak reading was. And that's really something that you got to play with the meter to get a feel for how to get to it. But it's not very complicated to get to. Just so you know that function's there. That's what those keys are for. The bump test and the calibration test, we'll talk more a little later about that, but not something we're really going to mess with on an active scene. Combustible gas concepts are talking a lot about the lower explosive limit and upper explosive limit. What does all this mean? How do we apply it to use of this meter? So we're just going to kind of go over these concepts real quick. Lower explosive limit, the LEL, this is the lowest concentration of a combustible gas in air that will support combustion or an explosion. Okay, percent volume in the air. And then the upper explosive limit would be that highest value, that percentage by volume of air of a combustible gas that you can have an explosion. So everything between the LEL and the UEL is called the flammable range, kind of the danger zone. So if you're below the LEL, you're in an environment that is too lean to burn, so you're not in that explosive range yet. And if you're above the UEL, you're in an environment where it is too rich to burn. Okay, an important thing to note about when you're over that UEL, you're not necessarily in a safe environment, because what can happen? That air or that mixture in the air can, through ventilation or just dissipation of that gas over time, you can get back down into that flammable range, right? You can go back down below the UEL into that flammable range. So that's something you got to be aware of when you're up over that UEL, that you can still get back down in the danger zone. And we'll talk about how the meter is going to react to that situation here in a couple minutes. Some other combustible gas concepts are just kind of using an example. The LEL for natural gas or methane by volume in air is 5%, and the upper explosive limit is 15% volume in air. So you can see that flammable range is between 5 and 15%. So a reading of 15% LEL, what does that mean? Well, it means you have 0.75% natural gas by volume in air. Okay, so remember, you need to get to that 5% volume in air of natural gas to hit that LEL, that lower explosive limit. So that 0.75%, 15% of the LEL, you're too lean to burn, okay? But it's still a situation that you need to figure out what's going on. Is it level going up, or is it the source been cut off and that level is going to be dissipating? Okay, so just as an example of how to look at that. Point of confusion of these meters over the years has been a conversion factor, and something that it's good to understand, but overall what we want to do is just take the actual readings when we're in the LEL situations, the actual LEL readings, to give yourself a safety factor. And hopefully, let me try to explain this. The meters are calibrated on pentane simulant gas. So the sensor for combustible gas, it can't specifically tell whether it's picking up a natural gas, a gasoline situation, or some other combustible gas situation. It just knows the way the sensors are sent to pick up that it's got a combustible gas coming in. It's been calibrated on pentane, so it gives you that reading based on what the LEL for the pentane simulant gas is. So what you want to do, if you want to be, use this meter or use the calibration table to have an understanding of where you're actually at, what you would do would be take that actual reading on your meter, that LEL reading, and multiply by the percent LEL reading in the table. So we're looking at natural gas. If you're at 10% LEL of natural gas in a natural gas environment, ideally, with that being methane, you would take that, multiply that by 0.5%, or 0.5 would be the conversion factor times the percent LEL, and really where you're at is 5% LEL. Okay, so it's actually less than what it's actually on the meter. But like I said, we don't want to get involved with trying to pull this conversion table out or remember what this means really in the natural gas situations. Give yourself a safety factor. So if the meter's telling you 10% LEL, yeah, it might be 5%, but give yourself a safety factor of that 10%. And another reason we want you to kind of not worry about applying this table in these situations is you got to understand when you're in the entry point, you might be at 10% LEL, but where is the level, say, up on the second floor? Okay, natural gas rises, so perhaps that you're at 10% at the entryway, but maybe you're at 80% LEL or at LEL on the second floor. So just give yourself a safety factor. understand this table. Where this would really come into play, if you could look at that table, you see xylene at the bottom. Would the multiply or the factor is 2.5, you would multiply that by your LEL reading, and that would obviously increase from what it's telling you. But really, the situations for us to be in where we'd be sampling for an environment like that would be, pretty much none. We really don't have xylene plants or much use of that kind of chemical or combustible gas in this area. But still, just good to understand, to have an understanding of how the meter works. Okay, so what does the meter actually do when you hit LEL? Okay, good, important thing to understand. Okay, what's going to happen is the LEL display or that combustible gas flag up on the top left of the screen, COMB, that reading is going to convert from an actual value, if you were at 50% LEL, 70% LEL, it's going to convert, it's going to go into an alarm, and that value is going to convert to XXX. MSA calls this a lock alarm state. This is their proprietary name for this. And this meter can only be reset by shutting the meter off and turning it back on in a fresh air environment once it's in the lock alarm state. So important to know that's what's going to happen, and the only way to reset it is to pull out to that fresh air environment. Okay, next question comes about, well, how does this meter function if I'm in a situation where it's over the UEL? And like I mentioned before, that's still a dangerous situation because we can go back down into that flammable range. So what's going to happen if I'm over UEL? Is the meter going to tell me that? Well, it is going to do that. You're going to go into alarm, and at the combustible gas reading, you're going to see the XXX. But at the bottom, between the bump and cow, with those indicators at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a flag come up over range. Okay, and that over range, that's telling you you're over the UEL. Okay, and my understanding from MSA is over range, if you're in an over range alarm situation, the meter doesn't necessarily go into lock alarm. If you just pull the meter back into a fresh air environment, it will come back down. But really, you'll know whether if you're stuck in that lock alarm or not. But you'll definitely know if it's in over range. We actually had an incident a few weeks ago where we were running a gas leak outside call, and we had a leak that we found in a outside curb box, gas shut off. We just stuck the probe down at the opening, and it was just a little tiny container, so it obviously went into the over range setting, so that it does function that way. So the sampling probe. So the sampling probe, the meter can be used without the probe, but its use is recommended. Okay, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The probe is absolutely necessary if we're dealing with a confined space monitoring situation. And I know this isn't really a confined space discussion, but the reason that we need to use that probe in those situations is because when you sample a confined space, you need to sample at the bottom of the space, the middle of the space, and the top of the space, and the probe is really the only way to do that. Okay, why I say it's recommended, even though it works without the probe, is just think like in your investigation, if you're dealing with this situation in a building, think about what the meter looks like and what it looks like with that probe attached, with that sampling cord and the probe. If you have to get up into a ceiling space or some other confined area, it just gives you that extra reach to get into those areas. When you have the sampling probe attached, MSA says you need to allow for a reaction time of about 1 second per foot of sample tubing. So our sample tubing that we only have one set right now. It's on the rescue with that meter. It should go back. We do have two MSA meters in the company right now, one on the rescue, one on engine 2. We only have one sampling tube with a probe right now. I hope to add one here for engine 2 soon. But the one on the rescue, that sampling tube and probe is about 12 feet long. So what you need to do when you have that attached is allow about 12 seconds to sample the particular area you're in. So when you come in, say for the instance, the entry point, don't just stand at the door for a second and then shoot into the building and move rapidly around the floor, because you might be missing what the actual reading is. So just give some time when you have that probe attached. And actually, just good sampling procedure, even without the probe attached. You want to be methodical and not just be in a rush to move around. Give some time to let the meter register the actual environment. Calibration, we're not going to be able to do that in this online presentation, but we have this Galaxy GX2 calibration machine from MSA. It's currently in the admin office. At some point, when we finish getting the breathing air compressor put in the maintenance shop at Station 1, hopefully we can get this set up once that's a clean and nicely arranged environment, that we have it over there that people can access to run the calibration. But it's very simple to use. It turns on, you plug it in. The little screen at the bottom, on the bottom right of the unit, is a touch screen. It displays screen as to where you're at. Once you turn it on, you turn the meter on, and then you just plug the meter into the sampling port, into the port at the top of the Galaxy probe, where you see that little port is, or that little connection point on the right side of the unit. It just pops in there, very simple, and it does the calibration automatically on its own. Ideally, we want to try to calibrate our meters about once a month. Different trains of thought of over calibrating, whether you do it every day, whether or not that reduces the sensor life of the sensors in the meter. But what we want to try to do is once a month, maybe 2 months at the most, try to run them through the calibration. Okay, moving on to the combustible gas detector. We have one of these right now, and it's currently on engine 2. And the idea with purchasing one of these was, a lot of times we run incidents where we smell natural gas, we use the combustible gas detector, but we got no readings. The level's nowhere near the LEL level, or even any percentage of LEL, but we know we have a leak, but we can't find it. This device can help us locate that leak. And it just works simply on, it has the sensor for combustible gas. It's not going to give you a percentage LEL. It's just going to be able to help you narrate or locate that leak. And the way this works, on the top where you see that little probe coming out on the top of the device, there's an on button. You push it, turn it on. The selector knob where you see on the left side of the unit, you want to start that all the way counterclockwise. Turn it on. It takes 20-30 second warm up time, and then you start to hear a tick rate. And that tick rate is what's going to indicate to you whether or not there's natural gas. As you get into a natural gas environment, that tick rate increases. After you've gone through the warm-up period, you want to turn that knob clockwise, and really where it ends up, it says you want to turn it to where your tick rate goes to kind of just a normal pace, and it usually ends up being to the second to last selection that you make going clockwise. The little dots on the bottom, those are LEDs. Those will light up as you get a concentration of natural gas. You will have some idea whether or not you're in a high concentration. So say you turn this on and you go into a room and you got all those lights lit up, you're in a higher concentration of gas. It might not necessarily be telling you have an LEL environment. It's just telling you have a high concentration in that room. If you're in that high concentration and the meter is in alarm, all the LELs or LEDs are lit up, and you say, okay, well, I know I have a leak in this room, but where is it? You just turn that knob counterclockwise to make it more sensitive, or less sensitive. So it's not going to activate within that natural gas area, and it will help you find that leak. Ideally, we want to use this the leak detector, combustible gas leak detector, in conjunction with the 4-gas detector, so that we have both to back us up. But like I said, the main purpose of this is to help us pinpoint a leak. And it will do in both situations where, like I mentioned before, where it's no LEL environment, and it will work if we are in a high concentration environment to help us find that leak if it's not obvious as to what's leaking. So moving on to the actual SOG that we have for natural gas emergencies. One thing to think about real quick is, how does natural gas end up in a building? Just think about that for a couple seconds. Okay, when you think about that, how does natural gas end up in a building? Well, the obvious, you have a leaking appliance or an interior gas line that's leaking for whatever reason, whether it be damaged or just a maintenance issue, developed a slow leak. Or you have underground migration from an exterior leak, whether it be a contractor was digging a trench and they struck a gas line outside, or just some natural, gas line, bad break in the line, and the gas leaked and migrated into the structure, what have you. Of these two, I would say where we've seen the most danger is the underground migration, where that leak is following a water line or the gas line into the structure. And the thing to keep in mind about the underground leaks is, well, what do we know about natural gas? Natural gas is colorless, odorless. The only reason it has an odor that we smell, that rotten egg smell, is because that's an odorant that is added to it to help identify when there's a leak. But when you have that exterior leak from the ground, that odorant can be stripped from the gas. So it might be making its way into the building with either a very different smell or no smell at all. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. But in our experience with gas leaks, a lot of times, or excuse me, at least one incident where we had a house explode up on Bonneview Drive. It exploded, didn't explode and burn, and exploded and just picked the home up off the foundation and sat it back down. That was a migration from an exterior leak. So general precautions. This is going to be a difficult one, but personal electronic devices, you're going to these type of incidents, just try to keep in mind to not take them, leave them in your car or leave them at the station, or at least just try to leave them on the truck, but do not take them into the hot zone. They're not rated as intrinsically safe and can potentially provide an ignition source. So try to avoid taking those devices into the hot zone. Turn the air monitoring equipment on outside of the contaminated environment. Preferably, we want to turn it on en route so that it's gone through its setup process, it's ready to go. We're not turning it on when we're standing outside of the structure, potentially in that environment, natural gas environment. What kind of PPE is required for these incidents? All members should be in full turnout gear, helmet, coat, pants, boots, to protect themselves. If there is explosion, they do have some type of protection from the debris that's going to be thrown out from that explosion. Members that are going in the hot zone and on a safety hose, they need to have an SCBA on. Okay, at what point do we go on air? And this is something that's new to the SOG, that in researching for this presentation and learning from the incident that happened in Prince George's County. The video you saw earlier is we want to go on air in the hot zone when the LEL reaches 20%, as indicated on the meter. Again, to protect ourselves. If we have the explosion, our face has some of that thermal protection if there is an explosion. Apparatus placement. On these type of incidents, structure fire, typically you get your truck company, your engine company, and as close as possible to the front of the structure, so you can pull lines, get the ladder to the building, aerial device, ground ladders. But in this situation, we want to leave the front of the structure open, so if there is an explosion, they're out of the blast zone, our vehicles. And we want to avoid parking over storm grates and manhole covers. Storm grates, a lot of times if you have a leak and it's an outside underground leak, migration type situation, that gas could be collecting in the storm drains. So we want to provide an ignition source by parking over the storm drains. And as suggested through the NIOSH report and just other department information, there is a tendency, if there is an explosion from a migration, that manhole covers can shoot up into the air violently. And we can end up with, if we park over top of those, damage to our fire truck and possibly rendering it unusable. So if possible, avoid parking over top of those things. So what are the company assignments for these type of incidents? One practical, the first truck or rescue company will assign a crew to the investigation. So one company or one practical, situation, we run the rescue out with the meter, and engine 2 is going to come out of station 2. So that rescue truck gets there, they're going to be assigned to the investigation. But one is a practical, one is a not practical, understanding the volunteer environment where engine 2 might show up 5-10 minutes before the rescue is going to get there, or a truck company. So we don't want those engine companies showing up and just not doing anything because it's a job of the rescue company. They can start the investigation if it makes sense. Ideally, the first engine is going to stand by at a water supply and provide a backup crew and safety line. Understanding a hydrant might not be convenient to the affected building. It might be a quarter mile away, not a good spot to set up a backup safety line. So we want to bring that first engine as close to the scene as possible without parking in front of the structure. So maybe your second engine is going to stand by at the water supply, if that makes sense. The truck company, rescue company, if they're not ready or available, the engine company, like I said, can initiate the investigation, and then just have your later arriving units fill the safety line roll in. So say engine 2 gets there, it's over on Babcock Boulevard, and the rescue's coming over. Okay, engine 2 starts the investigation. They have a meter to do that, and the rescue gets there. The engine's positioned, a spot that makes sense for the safety line. So the rescue crew is just going to pull that line off and act as that safety crew. And don't forget, we dispatch these incidents when there's natural gas leak inside a structure as a structural fire incident. So we're going to have a lot of mutual aid companies coming in, and use those companies as needed for the investigation or the safety line. But also don't forget, if we don't immediately need these companies, to think about a staging point. I know this is a lot of times an incident command function, but a lot of times we don't have an incident commander, a chief, or a lieutenant on scene. It might be the line firefighter that's making these decisions. So, be thinking about that. Where can you stage companies that aren't going to be immediately needed? Maybe the incident's on a side street, and you're going to stage all of your equipment on the main drag until you figure out what you need. The investigation, we want to minimize personnel in the hot zone. Ideally, try to keep the initial investigation crew to 2 people. The investigation crew, with the meter already on, is proceeding to the point of entry to the structure. And if there's no obvious leak or LEL reading or odor at the entry point, we want you to try to monitor going on the upper floors and work your way towards the basement. And that's really should be a goal for any type of structural investigation, is to work up and start up and work down. Because why? Natural gas rises. Unless you get there and you have the homeowner or someone's obviously indicating to you an obvious problem that you can go and work to rectify, but be worried about monitoring up high. That incident in Prince George's County, what they had there was an accumulation of combustible gas in the void spaces. So that tells me is the above that probably had drop ceiling with a void space between the drop ceiling and the bottom side of the roof deck. So they were getting natural gas accumulation in that area. So that's obviously something you want to think about. Those areas where natural gas can be getting up and accumulating into, get those areas checked. If there's an odor at the entry with no LEL readings, okay, we can enter at that point. Ideally, you want to use the TIF combustible gas leak detector in conjunction with the Altair to locate the source when possible. And again, hopefully we can purchase more of those combustible gas leak detectors so they're more readily available. And another thing we want to try to do is I know we need to keep the crews minimal, but we eventually want to get another crew there to back up our first meter readings with the second combustible gas meter leak detector, like the MSA Altair or whatever other companies are using. So we have a kind of a second meter opinion of the situation. Now, again, we want to minimize the people that are exposed. So maybe your initial crew is 2 people and your second meter crew is 2 people. So you have 4 people in the hot zone and everyone else is out in the warm zone at a command post or managing the safety line. We don't have 10 firefighters crawling through the structure trying to locate the leak. What do you do if you have LEL readings at the entry point? One thing that we didn't talk about in our original SOG is different levels or action levels. So if you're at 10% LEL or greater, okay, at what point do we evacuate? Well, 10% is what we're saying is have the occupants evacuate if you're at 10% LEL. So if you're at a single family dwelling, ask people to leave. If it's a strip mall situation, evacuate the strip mall. That was one thing that happened in the Prince George's County incident. They evacuated that mall very, very early in the incident, even though they didn't really have necessarily a percentage LEL. They did evacuate, and that probably saved some lives because all those people were evacuated when the explosion occurred. Shut off the gas meter if possible. I throw that if possible in there because there's situations where we don't want to say absolute. Every time we have a gas leak, we're going to shut the meter off. Think about a complicated commercial building like, for instance, the Highmark Medical Pavilion. Not probably a situation where we pull up, we have a leak in the building that we're immediately going to shut off their gas because that could obviously cause more harm, potentially cause more harm to the building. In those situations, we want to work with the building management, the maintenance personnel to figure out the best course of action. But in a lot of situations, a single family home, small commercial building or business, probably not going to be harmful to shut off the gas meter in a lot of situations. Next thing is to start the investigation. Okay, we have an uncontrolled natural gas leak. What that should read is uncontrolled combustible gas leak and an LEL action plan based on having an uncontrolled leak. We have an uncontrolled source, don't know what it is yet. So here's the different levels. At 10%, like I mentioned before, ensure evacuation of the occupants and non-essential personnel and shut off the gas meter if possible. 20% LEL, crews in the hot zone go on air like we talked about before. Interior investigation can continue. A little bit more importance placed on controlling the gas and the electric utilities from the exterior at this point. At 50% LEL, crews evacuate the hot zone until utilities can be controlled from the exterior if not already done. So at 50%, we don't know what the source is or we can't control the source. It's 50% increasing. We're going to pull out. At this point, we definitely want to consider getting the gas controlled somehow, and it's got to be controlled from the exterior. And we talk about gas, we also want to talk about power utilities. Obviously, electricity can be another ignition source, but what we don't want to be doing is going through the building or going to the utility room in the building and shutting off breakers. We want to get that power shut off from the exterior of the building. And some discussion from the NIOSH investigation was that the power company should be called very early on in these incidents to respond to shut off the exterior power at the exterior. It's a good train of thought, and it's probably something I'll try to keep in my mind responding to a more complicated type structure like this to at least get them started. But we know that response time might not be timely versus what we need to get done at the scene. So we're going to have careful consideration there with cutting the utilities, cutting the power, and our investigation, how to proceed through that incident when we don't have the utilities controlled. In any situation where we have a lower explosion or LEL reading, we want to avoid starting ignition or ventilation until potential ignition sources have been controlled. So gas shut off, power shut off. And that comes from, again, that NIOSH report. Um, is, you have that situation where you have that gas buildup in void spaces. It's potentially over the UEL or too rich to burn. What you want to avoid is just starting that ventilation blindly until you have those ignition sources controlled as best as possible. Now, does that mean if we respond to Mrs. Johnson's house and she had a gas leak and she opened up all of her windows, that we're going to hurry up and close all the windows? No, but just be aware that we want to coordinate the ventilation with the utility control. Okay, do not start ventilation until ignition sources are controlled. We talked about that. Do not control the electric utilities from inside shut-off locations, so we don't want to be going to the breaker panel to shut them off. We want to ideally get them disconnected from the exterior by the power company. If we're ready to do ventilation, we want to start up high. And again, that all goes back to the combustible gas is rising. And we want to pull crews from the hot zone while ventilating. So if we start ventilating up high, we don't want crews just lingering around in the building in the hot zone. So pull them out to a safe area to let it kind of vent out for a little bit. Go back in, see where you're at. Let it vent down a little bit. Don't let people linger in the hot zone. One thing that came out of the report is that they're saying that PPV is not recommended for these situations, primarily due to the chance for introducing a ignition source by turning that fan on to that environment. If you absolutely deem it necessary to use a positive pressure fan, we want to use it from a truck generator outside. Make all your connections prior to energizing this power supply. So the generator on the truck and kicking on that breaker, what have you, to power up that fan. We'll make all those connections before you do that, so we don't introduce that spark. So we talked a little bit about having a backup line. Just a real quick interaction with you is you see these different nozzles and fire extinguisher there. Which tool is right for the job if we're on the backup line? Okay, so we'll go through here. If you said that the combination fog nozzle would be a good thing to use, you're right. And the reason here is if we're dealing with a natural gas, if we get an explosion or fire, the fog nozzle, what that does is gives us the ability to protect someone. Ideally, we're setting this up as a backup line as a safety. So there's been an explosion, so we need to go in and rescue or pull someone out, whether it be a firefighter or a utility worker. That fog nozzle gives us position or ability to not necessarily put out that gas-fed fire, but just kind of hold it off so we can go in and grab whoever we need to grab and pull them out. Now, if hopefully, well, the fire extinguisher, sort of the same thing. If we're going to use a fire extinguishing agent, fire extinguisher would be an acceptable device. The smoothbore nozzle would not be an acceptable alternative to use on our backup hose line. And one of the reasons here is we have that smoothbore stream. If we have that natural gas fed fire, the smoothbore stream can actually make things worse for us by spreading that around. So we want to stay with the fog nozzle. And when we are finished with outfitting we get all the engines back in the company, the setup is going to be is the front bumper line will have a fog nozzle. And the idea there for these type of incidents, so that will be the line you want to pull as a backup line, or at least hopefully if for whatever reason you decide not to pull that, is to grab that fog nozzle or a fog nozzle from the pump compartment and adding it to the end of whatever line you're going to use. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Other inside leak considerations, sure, the gas utility is notified. Consider early notification of the power company, and especially like was kind of mentioned before, in situations of a commercial building or a severe leak, probably not a bad idea at dispatch. Say, hey, can you get Penn Power started or Duquesne's light started? You can always call them back to cancel them if they're not needed, but start them early because chances are you're going to need them in a very severe leak situation, especially in a commercial building. And if for whatever reason, if we go in and we shut off gas service, whether it be from a meter or an appliance, shut off to an appliance, we are not going to turn that gas back on or reignite pilot lights. Okay, so once it's off, do not restore service. That's for the gas company to work out with that property owner, not for us. And ideally, we want to stay, if we've shut off a gas meter, we want to stay on scene until someone from the power or the gas company arrives to kind of take over and do their thing with red tagging or whatever they need to do to make sure that the appliances or the gas service is restored the proper way. Okay, what to do at leaks involving a fire or an explosion, whether it be a structure exploded or some other type of outside explosion. So we want to set up for fire and rescue operations in as protected a position as possible. Ensure early monitoring by fire and gas crews. And what we want to do is monitor and expand the hot zone until we have readings that are 0. And then we do not extinguish gas-fed fires, not without the direction of the gas company officials. So unless they're telling us to extinguish something, we just want to leave it burn and protect exposure and provide rescue operations. So if someone's down, the firefighter's down, or people are down, or gas company officials are down, that suppression line's going in there just mainly to provide rescue. Or if we have a gas-fed fire and there's a structure exposed, to go in to protect that exposure, but not put out the gas-fed fire. And then throughout these incidents, we want to have ongoing monitoring of neighboring structures, storm sewers, those different utilities, to ensure that we don't have a gas leak. Okay, just because you have an explosion, you have gas-fed fires, does not mean that there's still gas or not gas leaking somewhere else at the scene. And this can become a very cumbersome task. So you have multiple companies coming in. I see ideally probably what happening is you might have a mutual aid company assigned just to monitor structures, go into structures to make sure that they don't have combustible gas leaking into them. It might be a whole neighborhood of houses. That's what we had to do up at the Bonneview explosion. We ended up going into pretty much every house around the block of that explosion. Very time consuming, very manpower intensive operation. So it's probably going to require a separate officer just to manage that operation. Outside leak considerations. We go to a lot of these a year. A lot of them end up being mystery leaks. Maybe it was just a blow off. The gas company had a pump station, a routine procedure. Someone smelt the gas from that. A lot of different reasons why we're called into these type of situations. If we have a situation of an uncontrolled leak, a gas line was struck somewhere, what we want to do is secure the scene as best as possible, and if we can, we want to check adjacent structures. A lot of times, if we'll see the gas company get on scene, that's one of the first things they do is they actually use their probes to check the ground around adjacent structures or the structure in front of the leak is in front of. So we want to try to do that as best as we can if possible to ensure that we don't have that underground migration type situation. We're not going to operate gas mains, so if we see that pump station or gas utility area near the leak, we're not going to go over and shut off any mains, anything like that. And as we would in any situation, like with a power line down, we're going to work with gas company officials because they're the most knowledgeable in these situations. One thing we want to be aware of is when working an incident, a serious gas leak, sometimes we've had situations where gas crews have had to go down into a pit to control a leak. If we see that happening and they're requesting that we stand by on scene, rather than us just being well-informed bystanders, what we want to do is set up a standby crew in full turnout gear and SCBA with either an ABC fire extinguisher and a 1 3/4 inch hose line with a fog nozzle. Okay, and then stand by while they're in that hot zone. So if there is an explosion, we have a crew that's available to go in and extricate or rescue those gas company employees if possible. Not necessarily, again, if gas fed fire, not necessarily for the purposes of suppressing the fire.